I thank you very much. Pleasure to be back among familiar faces and friends. I don't plan to make any comments on the presentations, but let me make two opening remarks before we start discussing the issue. You know, political theory has to be a historical venture. There is no political theory unless we look at the ideas, history of ideas. Political theory is different. Political theorists are supposed to address the political predicament of the day and tell us how best to resolve it. And for that, we need the help of our ideas since the ancients. The first question, can Indian political theorists access our resources of ancient India the way that Europeans can access the thought of Greece and Rome? Because we must not forget that in the 18th century, the whole metaphysical tradition of Vedanta was discovered by the German Romantics and subsequently became an object of great fascination for not only German scholars, but also the colonial power. I asked a friend of mine who teaches philosophy, what percentage of philosophy courses are in Indian philosophy? And she said 50%, and they're all taught through Wittgenstein. You should see the agonized debate read the agonized debate between philosophers on the rupture that was created when our ancient traditions began to be interpreted and the approaches, the methodologies of studying Indian philosophy began to be approaches. And I will just mention two philosophers every student of political theory should address: Bimal Matilal and J.N. Mohanty. Secondly, you know, J.N. Mohanty has remarked that ancient India, the Vedantic tradition, was very much like the Greeks because it was a tradition of debates. Except that in India, they never discussed the collective self. The Greeks did. In India, the debates were all about emancipation of the self. Now, that tradition of the polis, of the collective, being an object of investigation by political theorists, has to be looked at in a very short history way. Where do we look to? Political Science Department, the first department was created in 1920-21 in Madras, I think. And from then, when we teach political theory as the history of ideas, there has been no attempt to conceptualize these ideas. So you start with Raja Ram Mohan Roy and end with whoever is the latest fashion. Right? So then we go to philosophy, because philosophy is the root of political theory. And philosophy itself doesn't know where it stands, because you're so concerned with the way that the whole philosophical tradition has been cast in the Western mode of understanding. With these two opening remarks, and I'm not going to speak anymore, may I invite Professor Vidhu Verma to make a presentation? Vidhu?
No, she's supposed to.
Okay. Sorry.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me, Savita and Manindra. My presentation is titled, How Does Sanskrit Make Us Modern? And I'm drawing on the book that I'm working on, which is about the modern life of Sanskrit. So Sanskrit is unique among the classical languages of Asia and Europe. Unlike all its sister languages that flourished in the ancient world, it continues to live in modern times. It is not just that it is taught, studied, and preserved in universities and archives. It is not just that it is used as a liturgical and learned language in temples and monasteries. It is not just that it is used for rituals and worship by ordinary Hindus. The Indian government, as well as Hindu organizations of various sorts, have made efforts to popularize it as a spoken language, with television and radio shows, newspapers, films, and classes for students at all levels available fairly easily all over the country. There is an active community of scholars at specialized institutions who continue to produce new works of poetry, drama, philosophy, theology, and criticism in Sanskrit. Although the number of Sanskrit experts may be small, it is difficult to say whether it is significantly smaller in the 21st century than it might have been 1,000 years ago, or in the Mughal Empire, or in British India. For at no point in its long history was Sanskrit a mass phenomenon. A few important features of Sanskrit that distinguished it in the past: that it was a vehicle par excellence of erudition, that it was an idiom accessible only to sociocultural elites, that it had both bell-letristic and scientific dimensions, that it was central to a variety of religious traditions that we may call Indic, including Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism, that it traveled widely without having a specific geocultural address from which it originated, or an associated ethno-linguistic community of native speakers, and that it enjoyed state patronage which was fluctuating rather than stable and consistent. All of these features are in some sense true even today. But it is also indisputable that the overall vitality and prestige of Sanskrit have declined steadily since the advent of colonialism on the subcontinent, and that political independence in India in the mid-20th century did not necessarily reverse this trend. In the last quarter of the 18th century, once the British Orientalist and jurist William Jones realized that the classical languages of Europe, Greek and Latin, probably had a common ancestor with the classical languages of India, Sanskrit and Persian, a vast field of Indo-Europeanist comparativism opened up. Throughout the 19th century, the study of India in Europe, known as Indology, flourished, with Sanskrit philology as the key that was used to unlock the vast literature of India's ancient and diverse civilization. Not just the British, but all the major European powers, Germany, France, Austria, Italy, etc., took an interest in the study of the Sanskrit language and its texts as a way to learn about their own supposed Indo-European ancestry, whether linguistic or cultural. But knowledge being power, Indology became an indispensable handmaiden of British imperialism in India. By learning to read Sanskrit and translating it into English, the British gained unparalleled access to the history and culture of the subcontinent that they wished to colonize and subjugate. In a perverse sense, then, the British conquest of India from the 18th century, and even before that, from the 16th century with the arrival of the Christian missionaries to Indian shores, inaugurated in the history of Sanskrit a new chapter, that of Orientalism, Indo-European studies, and Indology. And while this encounter of Europe with India did not give rise to new kinds of thought or writing in Sanskrit, which actually remained true to its traditional preoccupations, genres, and methods, conversely, learning to read Sanskrit had a huge effect on the knowledge systems of modern Europe. Put in a somewhat dramatic fashion, while the British colonized India through political, economic, and military means, in what could be thought of as a stroke of epistemic justice, it was really Sanskrit that entered into the hearts and minds of many European thinkers, influential ones, and transformed the ways in which they made sense of the world. So to put it more directly, and this is something that I will argue in the course of my book, Sanskrit has, in the past 100 or 200 years, enjoyed a new lease of life through its profound impact on the West, seen most clearly in the emergence of the modern social sciences. How did Sanskrit travel so far outside its proper purview, which for 2.5 millennia lay within the cultural sphere, vast though it was, of pre-modern India, and that too of its Brahmin literati? How did it move out of its home in the aesthetic imagination, in religious belief, and in philosophical discourses? How did it then appear in the midst of an array of disciplines born during the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the world capitals of imperial power, scientific rationality, and cosmopolitan modernity, like London and Paris, Vienna and Berlin, Geneva and Zurich? The very notion that such a thing may have happened seems preposterous when stated baldly. Yet my proposition is exactly this. The discovery of Sanskrit and through it of a vast array of Indic narratives, ideas, myths, theories, doctrines and arguments by the European missionaries, merchants, scholars, administrators, intellectuals and artists who came to India or came into contact with Sanskrit texts by learning the language or by reading it in translation over a long period from the 17th to the 19th century contributed in a fundamental way to the making of the modern disciplines that we think of as being purely Western in origin and unproblematically universal in their validity. For us, in the way that we are taught to look upon global history from the time of Christopher Columbus, not only are these disciplines products of the European Enlightenment, they are then disseminated to India and in other parts of the world through the agency of imperialism and colonialism. When these forms of knowledge come to the colonies, they supplant, partly by force and partly by persuasion, local knowledge systems, which is also good for the colonized, so we are given to believe. The colonizers see themselves as educating, reforming, uplifting, improving, and ultimately civilizing the non-West through modern institutions and modern disciplines. But can we say with any confidence that these disciplines would have taken the form that they did had it not been for a long and slow process of epistemic osmosis, where knowledge flowed, albeit selectively, from India into Europe, as much as it did from Europe into India? And isn't Sanskrit the very membrane through which this mutually transformative osmotic flow, this interpenetration of knowledge systems occurs? Is it really possible to imagine structural linguistics, comparative philosophy, cultural anthropology, or classical psychoanalysis in the way that we know them to emerge and grow from the late 19th into the early 20th centuries, if we perform a thought experiment in which Sanskrit texts are simply unavailable to the Western mind? An intellectual history of the modern life of Sanskrit cannot proceed by looking only at what is happening in or to Sanskrit itself in modern times, whether in India or elsewhere. Rather, we must also look at how several modern disciplines, especially those that concern themselves broadly construed with language and society, so linguistics and anthropology, and with consciousness and selfhood, philosophy and the psi disciplines like psychology and psychoanalysis, are themselves brought to life by an animating infusion of Sanskrit through the operations of Orientalism and Indology. Seen in this way, Sanskrit, which appears to be dying if not dead, as a language of power and as a language of imagination relative to the supremely privileged position that it occupied for centuries in pre-modern India, as well as a broader space that, not just in India, but a broader space that William Dalrymple calls the Indosphere, Sanskrit reappears unexpectedly in a different guise. Its conceptual categories and epistemological capacities now repurposed for the very characteristically modern ways of knowing the world. Even more confusing is the fact that the disciplines within which it is hiding in plain sight are formulated and propagated in the European languages that define dominant knowledge systems in the colonial and post-colonial era, so English, German, French primarily. This is true not only in the West, but indeed across the world, including India, whose colonial experience exemplifies an epistemological conflict between dissimilar cultures of knowledge brought into an encounter that is at different moments either confrontational or dialogic, playing itself out through successive episodes, sometimes of serious misunderstanding and at other times of successful translation, that follow one another unpredictably over a long period of entanglement. Now, the trauma of colonialism is so fundamentally damaging, Ashish Nandi has shown, because it locks both colonizer and colonized into a reciprocally and reflexively wounding dynamic of intimate enmity. Violence that is inflicted on the victim is also simultaneously rebounds on the oppressor, leading to the violent repression of the very parts of the self that are most like the other. Conversely, the colonial victim too disavows what is experienced as the lack, the weakness, and the failure within the self that make it vulnerable, and instead tries to shore itself up by identifying with and mimicking the arrogance and aggression of the colonizing other. Both parties are not just locked into an antagonistic confrontation with one another, but also estranged from those aspects of themselves that would have brought about a rapprochement, or perhaps even mutual love. Some of the most influential knowledge systems of the modern world arise under conditions of colonialism, primarily in the 19th century and significantly in India. The external violence and intimate enmity inflicted upon and experienced by both sides during the course of the colonial encounter occludes the origins and provenance of the epistemological traditions, along with their concomitant discursive domains that go into the making of a forcibly and reluctantly shared epistemic modernity. Colonial India is the laboratory par excellence for the production of innovative forms of knowledge. As we learn from the work of scholars like Ranjit Guha, Bernard Cohn, Raymond Schwab, Wilhelm Halfas, etc. But together, the civilizing mission of empire and the loss of confidence of those who are the victims of imperialism are so overwhelming that both parties are equally liable to perceive this genuinely new knowledge as coming from the West and being taught to and or imposed upon the colonies. What Nandi, tongue-in-cheek, refers to as the transfer of technology model. Nandi's analysis of what he calls the loss and recovery of self under colonialism has implications for our attempt to track the modern life of Sanskrit too. Seeing the importance given to Sanskrit by the colonial knowledge apparatus, Indians too began to reassess its place in their own cultures of knowledge and power. I've described elsewhere the cultural significance of the discovery, as it were, of lost or forgotten texts, like the edicts of Ashoka and the Arthashastra of Kautilya, which contained ancient articulations of theories of law, state, governance, and war. Yeah. In my first book, I considered the influence of a range of classical texts on the political thought of some of India's founding figures, including Gandhi, Tagore, Nehru, and Ambedkar. I argued that these intellectuals and leaders and many others involved in the religious and social reform movements, as well as the anti-colonial and nationalist movements from the late 19th century up to the promulgation of independent India's constitution in 1950, turned to classical sources to formulate their ideas about political sovereignty, collective selfhood, and ethical norms for the new republic. Besides the templates of liberty, equality, fraternity, and democracy learned from the West and adapted for India's needs as an independent nation, it is equally important to recognize the role of Indian traditions in what is broadly called political thought that helps the founders to imagine a distinct path for Indian modernity. Gandhi turned to the Bhagavad Gita and Jain teachings for conceptualizing Swaraj, Ahimsa, and Satyagrah, while Nehru turned to the Ashokan Dhamma for his pluralist and pacifist ideals. Rabindranath's conception of historical time and patriotic love was tinged with the idea of viraha, a separation from the beloved that never ends in union, but extends indefinitely, his modern political imagination colored by the aesthetics of his ancient poetic ancestor Kalidasa. Ambedkar, I suggested, arrived in his political journey at a conversion to a new sect of Buddhism, the Navayana, because of the centrality of the Buddhist ethic of the idea of dukkha, suffering. He interpreted dukkha not as individual suffering caused by karmic debt and inescapable mortality, but as social suffering caused by the inequality and injustice of the caste system that afflicts Indian society as a whole. So, elsewhere, I have examined how Ambedkar studied not just the Pali canon, of the ancient Dhamma to craft a Protestant Buddhism, but also the Brahmanical literature in Sanskrit, the Vedas, Smritis, Puranas, epics, Shastras, etc., to excoriate and ultimately reject Hindu Dharma, particularly Varnashrama Dharma, for its cornerstones of hierarchy, patriarchy, and fatalism. The engagement with Indian political traditions was mediated, inflected, and offset by Western political thought, by the ideas of self-sovereignty, society, and morality drawn from a range of socio-religious traditions available in India, including Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, Islam, Christianity, and Bhakti, and by the critical impulses of many of the founders who opposed nationalism and communalism as ideologies, even as they struggled against colonialism and imperialism. I wanted to show that India's quest for the Swa in Swaraj, that is to say, political selfhood in political self-rule, was neither flatly nativist nor uncritically derivative. There's a complex and sometimes contradictory interplay of East and West, tradition and modernity at work. Ambedkar admired the American Constitution, burned the Manusmriti, and rejected the Four Noble Truths. Rabindranath railed against nationalism as much in Japan or the US as he did in India, but eventually came to be the national poet. His poem in Sanskritic Bengali enshrined as the Indian national anthem. Nehru's admiration for Akbar's Deen-e-Ilahi and Sule-Kul contributed to his secular ethos and his protection of cultural diversity. His invocation of Ashoka's Panchsheel as much as Kautilya's Arthashastra guided his foreign policy and domestic statecraft. And the Ashokan Dhammachakra and Sarnath Lion capital ended up on India's national flag and state seal respectively. So I'm just summarizing my findings about the two modernists, Nehru and Ambedkar, who were the most westernized and anglophone of India's anti-colonial leadership. The question I would like to pose is, in what ways does the coming of colonialism and the emergence of a colonial consciousness among India's political thought leaders affect their perception of Sanskrit? How is Sanskrit re-evaluated and how is it instrumentalized? What are the politics of these maneuvers? So I think I'll leave it there and I won't reprise the more intricate readings that I've made of Gandhi and Tagore as critical traditionalists and radical innovators in earlier work. I just want to say as a closing that Sanskrit has already been salient in India for millennia with its capacity to manifest, to borrow Sheldon Pollock's phrase, both Parmarthik Sat and Vyavaharik Sat, that is, transcendent or ultimate truth and mundane or worldly truth. But once the Europeans learn Sanskrit and turn it against Indians, as it were, it changes how Indians themselves regard Sanskrit. Sanskrit comes to signify not just whatever is being expressed in and through the myriad texts composed in this language, but it becomes in and of itself a sign of several different characteristics of India as such. That India is an ancient civilization, that India has sophisticated cultures of knowledge, and that India is a repository of transcendent wisdom. That India has a classical antiquity of its own, that India has much to teach the West as Vishwaguru, and if not more than the rest of the world teaches India. So I'll just leave it there, and my aim was to indicate that we have to think about colonialism and colonial forms of knowledge and the return to Indian political traditions in tandem with one another when we are talking about modern Indian political theory. Thank you.
Thank you, Ananya. Very interesting. One very good example of your last comments is Bhandarkar Institute, which set about transforming Sanskrit according to colonial notions of what is a precise knowledge and what is standardized knowledge. And there's a lot of written on how the Bhandarkar Institute started translating, started modifying its own knowledge of Sanskrit in accordance with Western norms. So we have to be extra careful about thinking when we think about, as she said, as Ananya said, about Indian political theory. Would you? This is your mic.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Vidhu Verma.
Very good morning to everybody, and thank you once again for inviting me. And I'm very happy to be here. It's a very special occasion to be part of such a kind of special, prestigious panel, and also to see so many young scholars here. I'm really looking forward to discussing with you and engaging with you on this. I would like to thank my co-panelist for raising this point, which will at least help me to advance my arguments, because translation is one of the most important challenges for retrieving political theory today. So the recovery and the recasting of political theory we are doing through translations in English language. Most of us who are experts in political theory have to rely on some of these translations, and because of the Sanskrit cosmopolis which existed at that time. And a counter to that, of course, would be that when we look at some of the ideas of the past, we have to overcome some of the methodological problems here, especially related to nation state, because nation states were not the spatial framework for some of these conceptual histories we are looking back to. India was never, I think, a kind of a mutable assemblage of cultural, political, and linguistic units. I'm trying to understand Kabir, and you find that there's a mixture of regional dialects here of Awadhi, Braj, Bhojpuri, and Punjabi. So it is not possible really for anybody to also understand oral compositions in one language. So translation will be one of the biggest challenges, and we should take that as given. And I'm very happy that you've raised it, and that makes my task easier. I would also like to thank the organizers for their note, for their concept note. I like the way they, instead of asking whether there is such a thing as Indian political theory, because I hope we have gone beyond that, they begin by recognizing that theorizing has always existed in India and in different ways. When I use the word India, I always feel a little kind of uncomfortable, because I think when we talk about the past, there was no India. I think this was, as I said, a huge region where there was so much migration and of ideas and of people and of goods and commerce, that we can't possibly start thinking of these ideas as limited in any territorial sense. So very clearly, I'm very happy that we're moving away from what many eminent scholars have complained about, the underdeveloped nature of political theory in India. But many questions have been raised due to this claim, and how we should do political theory in India is the question, namely by engaging Indian thinkers and traditions, and this requires a thorough interpretation of the history of ideas in order to reclaim and chart the forgotten provinces of Indian political thought. And as I said, no one person can really do this, as it is a question of pedagogy. It means a new component has to be woven into the existing teaching and learning framework. And that will take time. But we also need a second type of exercise, which I call an analytical exercise, that reveals the models of reasoning which structure these discourses. So the need for analysis is demonstrated by the observation that conceptions like equality, they're patched together from very different discursive sources. And that is why my aim today is really to introduce some of these terms like samta in contemporary political discourse, giving them new meanings and political significance, and to study the intersections between statist projects of emancipation related to equality and the popular utopias of equality. Do they have any connection, or were they just running parallel? Far from carrying on with this claim that we don't have good political theorizing, far from being confined to abstract concepts, I think Indian Indian intellectual traditions and anti-colonial political thought, these are two different things, have been integral to our political discourse and public life in recent years. And Indian classical philosophy has gained great prominence, as we all know, in the nationalist ethnic discourse. discourse or perspective as crucial ways of organizing various aspects of the political today. So we need to engage with this. Indian political thinkers have also addressed, contrary to what many experts have argued, they have addressed various structures of domination such as caste, patriarchy, communalism and class-based exploitation, seeking to reshape the landscape of political theory. I have in mind Ambedkar on compensatory justice and Gandhi on Swaraj and Tagore on freedom and so on. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on two kinds of questions, and I doubt I'll be able to address both of them fully, but I'll try. First is about articulation. What kinds of political theory have been done, and what theoretical futures are possible from within and beyond this space? And I'm going to try looking at Samta and saying that it was very much there as part of the classical tradition, religious tradition, as well as in Ambedkar's thinking. But I think Samanta is a term which is used in a more popular way. It involves comparison, distribution of resources, access to right holders, and so on. So the split between Samta and Samanta is the background to what I'm going to speak today. The second question, and I'm still addressing the concept note because it's there in the concept note, addresses whether there is a body of conceptual work that engages with universal questions from within Indian locations, languages and contradictions. So I answer the first question about articulation, but I'm unsure I can really do the second one in the time given, because I have I have given an abstract, but I didn't get the time to build on it. So I'm just going to give some background comments. There are three caveats before I go to my main argument. The first is, of course, about decolonization. And in this call for decolonization, I argue that we often take comfort in tradition and an authentic tradition based on what might be considered metric historical time. And this ethical nostalgia, to my mind, this historical conjuncture, it reflects a yearning for a continuity in a very fragmented post-globalization world, especially when appropriated by nationalist ideologies. Ideologues aligned with the nationalist ethnic perspective have advocated for the decolonization of everything from education to the constitution to consciousness itself. And this project is problematic because I think it conflates colonialism with modernity and calls for an indiscriminate rejection of Western influences alongside an uncritical acceptance of everything within the Indian tradition. While I do not reject this call for decolonization of knowledge systems, I advocate for a modality of reflection. I think Kaviraj has used it, but I'm not, that facilitates this process. So what is this modality of reflection? And I think this seminar represents a window of opportunity for new or previously ignored conceptions to be brought into play, thus provoking the thought that some aspects of non-Western thought may hold resources for a more sustainable future. Second is the methodological one. Now, after the era of Western hegemony, what should the internal structure of social science look? So when we talk about decolonization, I think we need to ask other questions also, which is, I argue that, it is mistaken to think that somewhere, this is my own position, which I want to just bring out, that cultural differences can be bridged solely through dialogue and hybridization. Leading to some kind of a common understanding. I find this really implausible because the claim that we can discuss, evaluate, integrate practices from many cultures ignores the dependence of these practices on incommensurable background presuppositions. So I'm a little kind of cautious about pluriversal approaches. What does pluriversal approaches mean? It means ontological dissonance, a kind of epistemic incommensurability. So assuming all cultures have some rational aspects that we can somehow catch hold of and then fit them into a universal framework reflects a kind of intellectual arrogance. Any new agenda for change must develop conceptual frameworks for the social groups that have been marginalized for centuries across cultures. And therefore I've used the term radical decolonial cosmopolitan approach because I want to acknowledge that we must look at distance. Maybe distance is better than understanding. Distance that respects the integrity of various kinds of cultures and traditions, and to rebuild alternative positive visions of the future. So let us, instead of talking about understanding, we talk about distance from cultures, and then arrive at this process of talking to such cultures instead of emphasizing the past. So the future as a political idea could then be proposed, moving away from searching for common or connections between cultures of the past. The third caveat is that when it comes to equality, there's little evidence of unilinear progress. So this whole idea that, when we understand equality, the scope will expand and so on. But I want to argue that sometimes it shrinks. Freedom shrinks, so does equality. And I think we need to discern that there is no such line of progress in concepts. In fact, we need to look at the interruptions, the reverses, which we are going through at the particular time in history, where we've actually seen a major reversal of gender equality, in our times, in our own times. Now, in the little time that I have left, I will go to the second part of the paper, which tries to defend a conceptual framework that moves beyond traditional Western defined moral principles, as well as the ethnic nationalist political theory that is today advocating decolonization in a big way. And my interest in Samta begins from that BBC broadcast which Ambedkar made, way back, when he says, I prefer Buddhism because of these three reasons, Pradnya and Karuna and Samta. So that's where I started thinking about Samta, because we don't use Samta in everyday discourse. But why is it that Ambedkar was so interested that he actually set up a journal called Samta? He actually set up a newspaper called Samta. He was involved in setting up of 2 organizations. And this whole slogan of agitate, educate, and organize and so on comes from that organization. But how somehow Samta gets marginalized, we talk more about Samanta. So this is something to think about. And so my main question really is that whether this idea of Samta equality is a coherent and even a possible one. Did the disparate use of this term, because it's used all over in our religious traditions, amount to some kind of a normative ideal that ran counter to our modern understandings of Samanta? And more importantly, are there resources within history which can, for me this is a very important question, are they, when we talk about these concepts, in our constitution and our everyday world, do they account for how do we understand whether there are resources within history which can, for current conditions, specify the causal agencies and capacities which are needed to achieve and maintain this ideal? Do we have the capacities to maintain this ideal? Or have we lost the capacities to achieve this ideal of equality and freedom and so on? How much time do I have? Fine. So therefore, the two of course, they are sources of Indian tradition. And they talk about religious tradition, which I will not spend time, because my main argument doesn't draw from there. That Samta is a religious or ethical ideal in the Shakti tradition, as well as in the Advaita Vedanta tradition. Samta is seen as equanimity, some kind of a dispassion, as representing characteristics of a person who achieves full knowledge of the nature of consciousness and so on, which will lead us out of this world to a better kind of, maybe to moksha, or whatever term you want to use it. And it involves detachment, some kind of meditative contemplation. When we come to Buddhist tradition, of course, which plays a very important role in Ambedkar for taking on the concept of Samta, again it is translated as equilibrium, as some kind of equality of existence and non-existence. And Jainism, of course, refers to Samta as absence of wrong fate or state of non-attachment, equanimity, and so on. So, keeping aside this, we know that there were apart from the religious traditions, we always had oral compositions and songs and stories and names and traditions. And in the 19th century, when Hindu reform movement awakened the concerns about the ills of Hindu society, we find that Bhakti saints had already questioned the practices of untouchability and social marginalization. And from that perspective, I go into the famous poet Saint Kabir, who wrote the famous lines, Jaat na pucho sadhu ki, puch lijiye gyan, which is really about merit, that we must learn to understand individuals through their merit. So this is quite a massacre of Kabir, but I'm going to be as short as possible because it's a very beautiful, song which I like to listen to in the mornings. But what I like is the second also term which he brings in, that mol karo talwar ki pada rehne do meyan, that it's not about the sheath in which the sword lies, but it is the edge of that sword. So it's important to see the merit in that. Again, he confronts us with the imperative, suno bhai sadhu, moko kahan dhoond rahe, bande main to tere paas mein, na tirth mein, na murath mein, main to ekant nivas mein. So he's questioning how, you don't look for God in idols and in temples and so on. And here I think there's a basic idea of, there's a concept of basic equality, that each individual's good is of equal moral worth and you're able to relate to the transcendental or the divine through that. But most important is this verse, which I like very much too, because it says, Kavira khada bazaar mein, mange sabki khair, na kahu se dosti, na kahu se bair. Now, this attitude is not a mere alienation of a disinherited soul, as Kabir stands in the marketplace. I think what he's trying to say is that having no friends and no enemies means to have the perfect equanimity, actually. How people come to express their common life or solidarity was by not giving up on the world, but by engaging in the world, to be detached in the way that you connect with everyone in the same way. So this argument about disengagement or detachment to therefore reach out to the other is what I was talking about. So maybe the idea of distance between cultures is important, and somewhere we would just rediscover a new social space and a new social imaginary instead of trying to understand each other when we have such incommensurable kind of ways of looking at life or cultures. So I will just quickly say that I also look at it as a relational understanding of equality, because it's intertwined with other notions such as similarity, independence, respect, and these ideas of equality, however, went well in hand with a deeply hierarchical caste order. And later on, Ambedkar is very critical of the Bhakti tradition, in fact, on these grounds that it did not question in any way caste discrimination in the long run. I've also taken up Ghulamgiri by Phule to look at how his idea of slavery then comes in. And I think slavery as non-domination is a very important contribution to our understanding of equality. And so in both Kabir's and Phule's Cosmopolis, because remember, Phule is also bringing in Tom Paine, as much as Kabir is writing in the region of North India, and we know that these were all songs, these were compositions. He never really wrote this. It was much later in the 1850s when Hindi literature was emerging that all these ideas come together. So I would just like to end here now saying that in Kabir's and Phule's Cosmopolis, what we find is some idea of the equal moral worth of individuals, detachment, similarity, and non-slavery and non-domination. And with that, yes, I think I will end here. We can always discuss. And
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I think both these papers required far more time that the organizers gave them to fully elaborate their very complex and very interesting arguments. But the organizers have their own compulsions, so sorry about cutting you guys off in full flow. Right, it's 12 o'clock and we have to break at 12:30 unless you're willing to give up your lunch. And that would mean if we leave 15 minutes for questions, Amir and Apala, is it? We get 7.5 minutes each. So if you could please.
You go first.
Amir.
ये चाहिए आपको, ये सब उधर जाए.
Only this works.
No, this contraptions have to go.
What are those things?
Thank you.
They are
Drones?
connected.
Yeah. Is this fine?
It has to go because that's
I'm scared of it.
connected to the recorder.
क्या करना मुझे? कुछ नहीं करना है. Makes it worse.
I know, I just realized.
Okay, I'll begin by sharing with you my first problem. I took very extensive notes, but I can't read my own handwriting. So that's the first one. Right, Ananya, my big worry is that whatever I say, as I open my mouth, my ignorance will be so thoroughly exposed. So I'm just going to say 2 points. And, please pardon me and bear with me if I make absolutely inane arguments.
You won't. But
I hope so. There were just 2 things that I latched onto your paper. And this is just my thought processes working as, I hope they do work, as I was listening to your paper. Firstly, you talked about a political maneuver towards the end. And then you talked about, I don't think you talked about this, the state itself. When I think about a language, the most significant thing about any language in terms of its promotion or its demotion, its upgradation or its degradation, is an active state. So let me just talk to you about Persian, for example. That's the only way I can understand this. Now, when I think of the way in which British colonialism evolved and we had the post-colonial Indian state, I can only think of these 2 processes happening in tandem. The demotion and downgrading of Persian as a courtly language and the systematic promotion of Sanskrit. And I think that these 2 processes cannot be kind of separated from each other. And therefore, when you talk about the political maneuver, which I do think you mentioned, I think that the most significant political maneuver when it comes to the fate of languages is what the state decides to do to some languages, what it decides to do to some other languages. I'm now saying this because yesterday, Amir, you're sitting over there, my Hamnam, we were talking about a 12th century Persian text, Farid Nattar's Mantiq al-Tair. Now, when I looked at the early editions, late 19th century, the publisher, Nawal Kishore. Now, think of the publisher's name, think of this Persian text, a very significant Sufi text. Now, this is the thing that, as I said, is very important to understand what exactly happens to Sanskrit. And I think that the particular act of the nation state in terms of its maneuverings of language, kis mohre ko aage badhana hai, kis pyade ko sacrifice karna hai, becomes very, very important. So that's about all that I'll say, but these 2 points will come back in my concluding observations. Vidhu, I'm on home ground, I think, when I do stuff like this. The thing about concepts, my big worry about bringing in concepts like something which comes close to equanimity. What I'm really worried about is this kind of exoticization of concepts. And I think we become fair game, especially to Western academia, which is our big interlocutor. And even when there's no Western academia person in the room, we're always talking about it because it is the elephant in the room. Now, I think that somewhere we have to kind of guard ourselves against it. Now, I'm saying this because whenever I think of concepts, I can't think about concepts without continuity, without rupture. I always think there's a kind of a history behind a concept. There's a normative power within a concept, and there's a normative future towards which a concept is indicating. Equality. This is one of the most unequal phases in human history. Never before has human history experienced these levels of inequality. Now, my only point that I would pose to you, Vidhu, is, can we have any degree of equanimity in the face of the outrages that we are witnessing in the world right now? I go mad in the morning when I read newspapers. I just go completely insane. I tear up the newspaper when I feel angry. And that's my problem. So I'm just trying to think, would it be possible to talk about equanimity in the intensely unjust phase of human history that we're living in? A kind of inequality that we see is like, my favorite book when I read inequality is this Stanford historian called Walter Scheidel. And his book is called The Great Leveler. And the point he makes is that whenever in human history, levels of inequality have reached the kind of tipping point that we see today, there are apocalyptic horsemen of the apocalypse who enter. Pandemics, we've seen that, right? Civil war. Mr. Trump, reminds me of Mr. Trump. Genocide. This is what we are witnessing in the world, and therefore I'm just a little worried about whether this kind of equanimity and this kind of, I interpret that as stoic calm repose, I try to practice that. I read Marcus Aurelius every night, Confessions. It just doesn't work with me. Okay, so that's the point that I want. Decolonization, I want nothing to do with it right now, certainly at this stage. The only people who are doing decolonization very well these days is a man called Mr. Jaishankar. In 2022, at a Bratislava conference, when he was asked about India's stance on Ukraine, he said, well, Europe must come out of this mentality of thinking of the world's problems as its problems as the world problems. So that's decolonization par excellence for you. So at this stage of our political experience, I want nothing to do with decolonization. Okay? Okay, now let me come to 3 quick points, and I hope I don't run out of time. These are broader points. Creativity. I'm always happy to be part of the Creative Political Theory Colloquium. Thank you, Maninder and Savita, for inviting me. I should have said this at the beginning, actually. But let me just make one point about creativity. You cannot engineer creativity. You can only garden it. Okay, Baghbani jisko kehte hain. Creativity is one of the most unpredictable things. You don't know when it's going to rise. Now, the point about political theory and creative political theory is that usually it arises in times of intense crisis. And oh boy, don't we have an intense crisis right now. If there's anything, this is the time for intense reflection, not exoticization. Now, this brings me to the next point. Creative political theory can only happen when you have a capacious imagination, not a shrinking imagination. Now, my worry about decolonization is that it partakes of a shrinking imagination. Now, I'm going to make this in the context of the light of the nation state. What has happened to Indian political theory is that it's simply incapable of partaking of the idea of an India that was more than just the confines of the nation state. I have in mind ideas like the subcontinent, or an Urdu term that I grew up with in the Urdu-speaking household that I was part of, the Bar-e-Saghir. A point that no one knows of. It means the Indian subcontinent. Let me extend the idea. When I read a historian like Marshall Hodgson, Chicago historian, right? He talks about the gunpowder empires, contiguous, the Mughals, the Safavids next door in Iran, and the Ottomans, abutting Europe, a Europe that is technicalizing and then kind of pushing on these empires. Or when I read the Harvard historian, we talked about Harvard Divinity School a while ago, right? Mm. The late Harvard historian, it's running out of time. Okay. 1 point should get anyway. He uses the idea of a Balkans to Bengal complex. Now, for a creative political theory, that's the Shah Ahmed. Okay, in his book, What is Islam? I should stop there.
Oh, that's abrupt. Thank you. He went so fast that I had to keep pace with you.
I had one more point to make.
Why don't you let him make it? Let him make the point. Let him make it.
Okay, can I say that? Oh, wow, that's like...
But I thought you finished. That's why
one point is left.
Ek bacha hua hai. Okay, last point on cosmopolitanism. I want to make a distinction that I've often made. And again, for political theory, I believe in a rooted cosmopolitanism. Okay, a rooted cosmopolitanism means a cosmopolitanism that has as its locale the part of the world that we are in. I do not believe in an insular indigeneity, which I feel a lot of decolonization is prone to. Now, why am I calling it insular indigeneity? Because in terms of its emphasis on the indigenous, it tends to implode within rather than diffuse. I think Ananya used the word osmosis and diffusion. I would always root for a rooted cosmopolitanism. Last point.
Thank you. Apala?
Thank you, sir. Let's quickly start with the first paper. I like the metaphor of Sanskrit as a membrane for epistemic osmosis. I think it disrupts the colonial trope of unilateral Western enlightenment, and this is a much-needed intervention. But while recognizing Sanskrit's influence, it's important to question how this exchange of knowledge was uneven and selective. Why was Sanskrit's language and philosophy adopted into Western disciplines, while many other Indian knowledge systems, especially those outside the Brahmanical tradition, were ignored or erased? For example, colonial scholars often overlook local languages, oral traditions, and indigenous political practices like village councils and tribal governance. We also need to ask how this selective borrowing helped colonial powers by portraying India's knowledge as old and unchanging, which then justified the colonial rule as a modernizing mission. What changes do universities and academic institutions need to make to recognize and support these diverse ways of knowing? Should we rethink and refocus on Western texts and methods, and instead encourage collaboration between Indian and global knowledge traditions? Answering these questions, I believe, would not only honor Sanskrit's important role
but also help break down old colonial power structures and knowledge, while protecting these ideas from being distorted for narrow political ends. The second paper offers a rich, historically grounded exploration of samta, equality, not as a fixed universal ideal, but as a relational, contextually embedded concept that evolves through India's diverse political and social trajectories. While the paper skillfully maps multiple strands of equality, it also raises several critical questions that merit further exploration. How does the concept of similarity as equivalence negotiate the tension between recognizing difference and affirming equality without collapsing the former into the latter? For example, in caste and gender struggles, how do we avoid flattening distinct identities while still affirming shared claims to justice? The paper suggests that samta was initially pre-political and compatible with hierarchical social orders. How then do we trace the moment or mechanism through which samta becomes politically mobilized to challenge those very hierarchies? Is this process uniformly progressive, or are there ambivalences and contradictions? The papers call for conceptual renewal through micro-interpretations, and pluralogical engagement is timely and promising. To deepen this, I propose the following. How might Indian political theory actively incorporate subaltern voices and vernacular political practices in constructing samta today? For instance, can grassroots movements like Dalit feminism or tribal self-rule inform a re-articulated equality that resists both homogenizing nationalism and Western liberal individualism? Given the paper's emphasis on the colonial and post-colonial conditioning of Indian concepts, what role can non-Western methodologies, perhaps drawing from indigenous epistemologies or oral traditions, play in both academic and popular political discourse? And lastly, how might formal political institutions, especially the judiciary and the legislature, be transformed or reimagined to better reflect the lived realities and demands for substantial equality? Are affirmative action policies sufficient, or do we need more radical restructuring of social and economic relations? Thank you. Those are my submissions.
Thank you. That was disciplined. Right. I shall request the two main speakers to hold on to their responses. And I think we have time for precisely...
Also was working on the contemporary political theory project in India. Does it make the Western tradition somehow less remote to us? And how do you think that changes basically how we engage with the Western tradition comparatively or as a map to create our own?
Thank you. All right. Anybody? One more question from the right side. The world is turning right and there are no questions. Yeah, I suppose. Okay.
That right is not this right.
Wait. Yeah. I mean, that's in keeping with the right. They don't ask questions. Okay. Yes. Since you're so anxious, come. Now we come to the center.
So, actually, there is two questions to the previous panel because my question was not taken because paucity of time, and one question to this panel holistically. So, I think Savita talked about that there is a plural thought and diversity of thinking in the Indian political thought.
Question. No, you can't ask Savita a question in this session.
No, he was not.
1 minute.
So, my question is not to entire Indian political thought but to current modern Indian political thought, where Yogendra Yadav asserted that there has been the emanciated of the political thinking and syndicate of the lack of the political thinking. So he provided various examples, like the more recent example is that in post-colonial during 1980s, so the political thought has been relegated to the world of academia, and it has been only.
Sorry to interrupt you. Could you ask questions of the two speakers,
yes,
please? This is this session.
So, yes,
sorry to interrupt you. I'm sure you have very important things to say. Yeah. But let's confine it.
So this panel, their question has been that the aim of this discussion model in the podcast is to decolonize it. So here we are talking about decolonization, and it has become buzzword in this conference room. So my question is that we are talking about the decolonization of that modern Indian political thought, all those things, and we are doing that too in the English itself. So this is not a kind of dichotomy that we are decolonizing the Indian political thought and debating and discussing that in English itself and carrying forward the remnants of the colonial legacy. And I'm asking that question itself in English, it shows that.
Right. Thank you. Thank you.
Ask one question of Krishna.
No, it's can you? All right, guys, that's enough. Thank you so much. Wait, your turn will come. Come. Come to the gentleman in the blue shirt.
So my question is that
You have to come here to the mic.
That's a nice one.
I'm not from JNU, so I won't recognize you by names.
so my question is that, for example, we have a lot of time we have mentioned Vedantic philosophy, and Shankara comes a lot of times. As you have mentioned, the theory should be backed by history. The history of the Shankara is that when he established 4 but the condition is that you should know Sanskrit, you should know Vedas, and third is problematic, that you should be born in Brahmin family. The one who is recognizing this word as illusion, how does he, this is a dichotomy for me. So the question mine is that rediscovery of Indian political thought should be backed by the, how does the other has engaged with, like the Kabir and the...
Point is well taken. Thank you. You know, it's a very good point, and Pradeep Gokhale, in a recent article on his... May I speak for a minute? Yes. Has said, how can you think about bringing a gender-specific and a caste-specific philosophy to contemporary India to make it the basis of a political discourse? Pradeep Gokhale is the author of Charvak. You should read him. I mean, you know, he gives you this... And Amir talked about subcontinent. I would say that in India, actually, political theory is being regional. You go to Maharashtra, you will have a completely different tradition. Go to South India, it will be a completely, and Bengal, of course, thinks it's autonomous of us. So so they only talk about Bengal. So, point is that, once I told Partha Chatterjee, I said, you people write the history of Bengal and tell us it's the history of India. He said, no. He said, we write the history of Bengal, you think it's the history of India. I said, no, that's not the history of Punjab, it's not even the history of Tamil Nadu. I mean, so I would suggest, Amir, you think very specifically about regionally rooted political theory. And if you go to Pune, Bombay, Mumbai, it's all Phule Ambedkar. Your kind of question will go down very well there. And I was wondering, you know, perhaps we could take these, you go to, unfortunately, we are in Delhi, and except for Amir, nobody has mentioned Persian Urdu, the Islamic tradition, which gave us such rich political philosophy. So it's time we widen our brains and think what will be appropriate for contemporary India. Yes.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. One is to Professor Vajpeyi, that the kind of osmosis that you said that Sanskrit led to a change in Western knowledge traditions and of course their institutions. A dangerous implication seems to be that is there something latent in the structure of Sanskrit itself which lends to domination? The second is to the panel in general, like we have been discussing Indian political theory, but have we already chosen our ends that we want the political institutions in the current form and we want to use Indian concepts to lend whatever, cash them out in a way that the structure remains intact, or can we imagine a completely alternative structure of political institution?
Thank you so much. Yes, from the left, my left, I mean. I don't believe no questions. Okay, guys, that gives us 5 minutes each for the 2 speakers to respond. Here, Vidhu.
Yeah, please. I think in order of how you spoke.
To the question about osmosis, etc., and how do we then revisit, modern social scientific disciplines and their theoretical constructs. I actually, in my book, which I am writing, I'm trying to do that for a number of disciplines, right? The part which I've done over the last year has to do with psychoanalysis and builds on Ashita's work on the conversation between Freud and Girindra Shekhar Bose. And I try to understand the interpenetration of knowledge systems through these encounters between Indian intellectuals who try to become psychoanalysts, and also figures like Romain Rolland, who mediate that conversation between India and Freud and Freudianism in the West. And then I go on to look at how Indology is shaped by psychoanalytic readings, in more recent times by people like Goldman or Doniger and many others. So I'm trying to see that, if there had been no encounter at all with Indian knowledge traditions, could we argue that a discipline like psychoanalysis would have arisen at all without engaging with theories of the self that we have and that have reached the West through this colonial conversation, right? That's one example. Another example is I'm trying to look at modern structural linguistics and Ferdinand de Saussure as a Sanskritist, and how his theory of the sign, of the signifier, of langue and parole, etc. What is its conversation? Its formative, foundational conversation with Panini, Patanjali, etc. I'm trying to reverse read how these modern structures of thought are arising in the first place at that moment of juncture between India and Indic traditions and the West and Enlightenment traditions. So I'm trying to show this through a number of examples. There's many others, including looking at the project in the Bhatnagar Institute of preparing a critical edition of the Mahabharata over the course of something like 60 years, in the early part of the 20th century, and how Sukthankar's position as the lead on this project, how he comes out of his training in Germany in a certain kind of tradition of manuscript reconstruction and critical philology, and by the end of his life he actually dies in the middle of the project. He's speaking in a very different way about this book of books, etc., and what is the Mahabharata and how is it important for the nationalist project. So I'm trying to look at various locations where you don't expect to find Sanskrit there at all, but I'm trying to show it, bring it out into the light and say, let's think about both directions of this conversation that were taking place as a result of colonialism, to get out of our bind about decolonization, derivative modernity, and so on and so forth. To your question about domination, actually that's very central to my understanding of Sanskrit, right? That, what does it mean to be a Brahmin, or what does it mean to be a Shudra? And in relationship to this language. And it has always been an ethical question which I've tried to address through Ambedkar, through Gandhi and other ways, that, is there something intrinsic to Sanskrit, as you said, that, allows this posture of mastery, of arrogance vis-a-vis whatever it is that is the object of knowledge. And in one place, and I'll just stop after that, I look at, the etymological closeness, proximity of Shastra and Shastra, right? And discipline and punish, right? But discipline in both senses, as in achieving mastery over a field, that kind of Brahminical sense of, having an adhikar over a particular field, but also shasan and shastra and violence, right? And that these are very proximate concepts, and they are at the heart of what Sanskrit has done in the kind of work that it has done in our history. So I'm trying to theorize that as well, but also complicate it with modern ideas of domination, power, sovereignty, etc. To which it is inevitably subject. I mean, as Vidhu was saying, as Amir was saying, you have to look at state. Now you just have to look at everything with regards to nation state. Either you're coming up to decolonization, or you're colonial, or you're post-colonial, etc. But those are not the only ways in which to understand how a language has a life in any historical moment. Those are important ways, unavoidable. But I'm trying to also explore, an epistemic landscape where Sanskrit, I think, is playing more of a part than it actually is in like a radio broadcast in Sanskrit, right? Which arguably, nobody listens to. Thank you.
Just one comment before I pass it on to Vidhu. Sohail Hashmi has done a brilliant piece as an introduction to Saif Mahmood's beloved Delhi, in which he says the moment Mahavir and Gautam Buddha started talking in the Prakrit, in the natural languages, the upper caste domination of minds and culture and religion disappeared. For the first time in history, everybody could understand complex moral dilemmas. And then it's a beautifully written piece how he talks about the spread of languages which gave rise to many languages, many dialects, and people who were excluded, as he said, from the Sanskritic upper caste Brahmanical tradition were able to grapple with complex moral problems. Coming back to Amir, at the turn of the century, when they had a revolution in Urdu literature and Urdu poetry, Persian got phased out, and the idea was that Urdu poets should stop talking about love and viraha and the shama and the parwana and start looking at their society. Since then, Urdu became much more communicable, much more rooted in society, and led to a virtual revolution. I mean, the formation of the Progressive Writers Association consciously eschewed Persian. So you see, language has to be connected to a class or a caste. You just can't speak of language in the abstract. Looking at the Progressive Writers Association, you can trace this progressive trend in Urdu. At a time, Hindi was becoming more Sanskritic because of Hindi Urdu problems. Right till the end of the turn of the 20th century, Ghalib started it. But then you had these two great, Muhammad Azad and I forget his name, though I know it by heart, writing, saying, forget Persian. In any case, we don't want to remind the country of the Mughal court. Talk in a language which is communicable, and Urdu had a major transformation. Sanskrit, the advantage is now we can read Sanskrit in the Roman alphabet, so we can read all the thing. But I don't know if Sanskrit has really kept pace with the way Indian society is going. You'll have to tell us another time. Vidhu, please.
Thank you. So many questions, and I really want to address all of them, but given the time, let me just put them all together. One is, I think, this question of what I call the Indian political philosophy or classical tradition. I don't like the word classical, but let's use it for now so that it's clear what I was trying to do. And I think there are, there are lots of problems in getting into the past, in that sense, trying to recover all these concepts. There's a vastness of the tradition, which is really mind-boggling. And for that reason, for many years, I spoke about it, or I would write about it, but I really didn't, I didn't write about it. I used to discuss it in class and so on, but I avoided that because I think there's a double-edged sword about reading the past through classical texts, because they can actually constrain us instead of liberating us. They can trap us with notions that are outmoded. For example, you might say, well, who is using Samta today? But I thought that when I kind of went through Ambedkar's writings, that he uses it and he relies upon it a lot till a certain point, and then he lets go also of that term. It doesn't really appear in a big way in his writings. So I think that extravagant claims cannot be made about the past because we don't have the resources right now. And I've said that it has a lot to do with translation. I mean, all that what we are doing today, and this young gentleman, yes, we are absolutely in agreement with you that we are talking in English and so on, but I think this is the process of recovery. We are in a period of transition. I think after 20 years, you will be sitting in this room with a very different set of people who will be talking from, as you said, a rooted cosmopolitan kind of perspective, bringing in what I call colloquial, maybe, cultures and concepts, and maybe there will be a different kind of mediation. But yes, there is this challenge, and we are trying to overcome that challenge. And I think, therefore, translation into English is not a bad idea. I know many experts think that we have really lost the game somewhere and we are never going to recover. But I think maybe this transition requires this. We have to go through this process of accepting English, because this is the translation we have, and we cannot do without it. So I must say, in my age, in my sort of lifetime, I don't think I'll be able to. I've tried to do Pali, but I don't think it's possible for me to really learn and understand Buddhism. That's why I don't write so much on Buddhism. I write more about Ambedkar's interpretation of Buddhism. So these are some of the problems of doing Indian political philosophy and viewing this as something which we can just overcome. But I also want to go back and emphasize two things, that we are also reinventing tradition. Obviously, please don't think this is going to be a fossilized kind of tradition that we are going to carry on. I know the nationalist ethnic perspective does that, but I believe that we need to come out of it and show how we are different. We reinvent traditions. We try to, because I think traditions depend upon the self-understanding of a community. I think it's all about an ongoing process of interpretation. That's what we are doing here. So let us not see this as something which is out there, which we are just going to grab and try to understand it more. It has to relate to our present. And linked to this is the idea of equality and agency. Who are those who are involved in this translation or reinventing? Are we involving everybody? Or again, are we going to be another elite who will talk about decolonization in these very, very difficult concepts? So I think equality and agency is also very much there. For a very long time, I think most of the political thought experts, if I may put it this way, used to be bound to a tradition modernity kind of framework, or then they went into the state and development framework. We are trying to come out of that and say that we need to look at who are the interlocutors, as somebody pointed out, that this is a very unequal process, and so how do we go about it? So that's the first thing about classical political tradition, intellectual traditions in India. The second is about this concept Samta. I tried to expand on it because I found there was not much interest in it, and yet it is very much there. So it's one of those concepts which nobody seems to be very interested. But I thought it had, despite having a cultural embeddedness, it's very interesting that we did get rid of it, and we talk more about Samanta, and maybe the socialist tradition, the liberal tradition, and so on, went into that. But I think there's another reason which I'm still grappling with, and you can help me after this talk. I thought that maybe this idea of distance, equanimity, and similarity never got rooted. And somehow we don't learn to respect each other as persons. When Kabir is talking about being in the marketplace, that you're nobody's friends or enemy, I think that's how it should begin. that you're actually nobody's friend or enemy. And that's how you start respecting each other, rather than assuming that we have these identities with which we have come into the market, and therefore we need to then respect differences. So the response to that bit about, yes, it has no, I don't think it can really relate to our current predicament, political predicament and so on, but it does make me think a little about thick and thin concepts. And I thought that equanimity here is not really a very thick concept. And is that the reason why it just had a kind of natural death? Whereas when you talk about equality in terms of reservation policies, and we all are familiar with what is happening in Maharashtra today, and the OBC kind of beneficiaries have become, they have been expanded. So is it because we didn't really go through this phase of first respecting each other, but we've launched into this competition for equal gains in public policies? So I'm not trying to overlook differences. That was not my aim at all. I'm just trying to kind of interrogate what happened to this concept, although it's an interesting concept, that of distance and equanimity, and yet today we cannot rely upon this. Thirdly, this whole idea about, there's one more point, I think maybe I've forgotten that, but of decolonization. Yes, I don't at all find this very comfortable. I have already said in my, in my presentation that I actually think that there are lots of problems because of this epistemic or this kind of ontological dissonance which is accepted in pluriversal approaches. So if that is so, how are we going to approach each other? We are assuming that we have thin concepts, but if we have thick concepts, then I don't know how we're going to reach out to each other, because we seem to be very interested in thick concepts and not in thin concepts. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all the four panelists. This made for a very, very animated session and discussion. Thank you, guys. I'll leave it to the organizers to make the subsequent.